Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. I imagine we'll get some more people slowly trickling in, as we usually do for these sort of events. My name is Cecilia Koger. I am the Director of Exhibitions and Public Programming at Angels Gate Cultural Center. And before we begin, I just want to give a quick acknowledgement. Angels Gate Cultural Center is located in San Pedro in the Port of Los Angeles region in California. We recognize that we live and work on the traditional and sacred lands of the Tongva, Kizh, Ahachiman, and Chumash, and the many other indigenous groups who call these grounds home. We at Angels Gate Cultural Center honor and extend our gratitude to all of the original peoples still living in this region. Again, thank you very much for joining us tonight. Just so you know, this meeting is being recorded. There will be an opportunity for everyone to ask questions and engage directly with the artists at the end. So you can either save your questions until the end, or if you want to enter them in the Q&A feature as we're talking, that way we can keep a list of questions for the artists. So at Angels Gate Cultural Center, we aim to provide programming opportunities for artists while serving our local communities in San Pedro and the South Bay Harbor region. The exhibition program at Angels Gate aims to explore new ideas in contemporary art and provide opportunities for artists and independent curators. I'd like to thank John David O'Brien, who in early 2020, before things got crazy, he responded to a national request for curatorial proposals, and his proposal for Betwixt and or Between was selected for its strong vision and assembling a very dynamic group of artists who I'm very lucky and we're very happy to have several of them here with us tonight. So with that, I'm going to pass it to David if he would like to tell us a little bit more about this exhibition.
Thank you, Cecilia. So I am an artist, and I'm also, and sometimes a curator, but more often I'm an artist organizer, which is a person who curates the show while being in it. While that might seem to be a contradiction for the idea of someone who's above and beyond all the parts, I actually find it to be a more seriously engaged position, because I have to be aware that every time I put my things in the world, I'm putting them in with enormous seriousness. And so I invite others who I feel are going to be doing the same. Betwixt and Between came to mind because of actually Angels Gate, because I was born into a military family, and the military bases are something I'm very familiar with. My own family did not live on base that much. We lived on what was called the economy, which is in the cities. But every time I went to Angels Gate, I had a twinge of like, oh, nostalgia, look, it's a barracks. So having this idea of being a show in a place that's related to my life, going back and forth around the world. I was born in Japan. I lived in the United States as a teenager, and I moved to Italy, where I discovered that my mother actually was originally from Italy. Her father was born there. So I'm an Italian and I'm American. And I've always felt like I am kind of betwixt and between cultures, between moments. I feel like I'm lucky and that I'm an insider outsider. I'm an outsider, but I can also find ways in. And so I invited artists to consider the idea of betwixt and between, and to pull it to themselves and to their work, and to not make it a cookie cutter kind of an idea. The notion of the betwixt and between could be many things. It could be geophysical, it could be more spiritual, there's just many, many different directions. And that's what I was hoping would happen, so that there would be this wonderfully pluralized view of ways in which artists conceive themselves. Artists could put in works that were newer, works that were older, a combination of newer and older. And I did not spend an enormous amount of time making sure that they kept with a specific theme. I was just entrusting them with the idea of this betwixt and between. I thought, what better place to be showing it than down at this point of land called San Pedro that overlooks the ocean, betwixt and between, you know, the ocean out there and then the land in here, and on this wonderful base that's been turned into a cultural complex. So I would say that that's the introduction that I wanted to give. There's a written statement that you can find at the website that fleshes out a little bit better. But I actually want to do the thing that I think is the most germane, which is I'd like to turn the conversation over to the artists themselves. So any of them who feel like turning on their camera and eventually their mic, it would be great. I was going to ask if Alexis would talk, and then Mark Steven Greenfield, Alexis Zotto, Mark Steven Greenfield, then Pam Posey, then Rene Lotenero, Ismael de Anda, and Eugene. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the work of Shirley Tsay, Fatima Burns, And then Amsa, before I talk about myself, because they could not make it this evening, because they were located someplace geophysically where they could not get to the right connection, they didn't. But if Alexis, please feel free to take your presentation wherever you'd like to go. I only said that I invited you, but I don't think I corralled you into anything other than offering you this chance to be a part of this event.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to participate in this show. When I first got your invitation to participate, I was so struck that I felt like, oh my gosh, I mean, I've known John for many, many years. I was like, oh, wow, he really knows my heart, because I really feel very much like that is a better way to say how I feel betwixt and between, in terms of my experience, my identity, and how I work. My work is grounded, centered in my identity and my ethnic heritage, which happens to be Albanian. The work that I'm showing in the gallery is tapestry weaving, which is also, I feel sometimes is also betwixt and between, because it's between art and craft. It's between art, craft, and design. I'm using typography and materials. It's 2D and 3D. And when you're weaving, you're also tapping into this art form and craft that's been going on for millennia. The work that I'm showing, a lot of them are based on this series called Mashallah, the idea, or Masha'Allah. This is it in Arabic. I made a series of them in Arabic, in English. This is in Turkish, Northern Macedonian, so it's a Cyrillic letter form. This is it in English, Masha'Allah or Mashallah. And the origin is Arabic in nature, but growing up, I heard it all the time. And I grew up, like I said, in an Albanian household, community, diaspora community. And so as I was researching and learning about it, I was really delighted to find out that it's a wish. You say it in protection, wanting protection from the evil eye. You say God's will is the direct translation, but it's crosses geopolitical borders, religious borders, ethnic borders. And I love that about it. And as I was researching, I learned it actually went even beyond the Mediterranean world. And when I made it in Greek, it doesn't sound like mashallah, but it's the same sentiment. So the other pieces, the other tapestries included are one I think you showed that had sort of symbols, and that was based on research that I had been doing on Albanian kilims and sort of playing with, this one, thank you. Playing with certain traditional motifs and playing with them in scale and color and sort of changing them and how they would be normally traditionally. And this was sort of like a precursor to a much larger mural piece that I did at the LAX airport in Terminal 1, which just came down. But and then there are other ones that are even more abstract, but like this one, yes. And so as you can see, kind of that there's a play with also materials. So I like to use and upcycle materials. So a lot of things are from my household, things that are at hand. So some things are like craft materials that my children have. There's ribbons from gifts, shoelaces, hair ribbons. There's, I made a piece that has roving, this one, which is just the raw wool that's not spun into a yarn. And it has some clothing that I also spun into a material to weave with. And then another one has made with plastic dry cleaning bags that I used for the fringe. And I also spun it to make material to then also weave with. And using different kinds of stitches and different kinds of techniques to explore this idea of mashallah and like I said, and also the typography. And I think that's it I have to say about Oh yeah, I know what I want to say. One more thing about Albania. For those of you who don't know about Albania, it's a really teeny tiny country. It's about the size of the state of Maryland. And it was a cultural crossroads. It is predominantly Muslim country with Christian minorities, both Orthodox and Catholic. And so it was, occupied by the Ottomans for a long time. So that really reflects in its culture. So that culture in and of itself has a lot of betwixt and between in it. And then it was brought here in my family.
Thank you for being the first to speak. Mark, would you be up for talking a little bit about the things you want to talk about?
Yeah, I guess so.
Thank you. Anybody who's an artist who wants to be on screen, just turn your camera on. And if you don't, we'll.
I was raised Catholic, and consequently, I went through all the ceremonies, and I really enjoyed the pageantry and the ritual that's associated with Catholicism. But when I reached the age of reason, and I reached that age fairly late compared to a lot of people, I kind of got sick and tired of the dogma, and I really kind of rejected it. And it's interesting, when I was in my undergraduate, when I got out of school and I started taking my slides around to show people, they would say, well, we like your work, but it's so ethnic, which was actually code for Black, which was actually code for unmarketable. So in a way, what I've been doing recently is kind of a slapback to that whole thing, because when I was in school, I was studying about Bernini and Raphael and Leonardo da Vinci and all the masters. And now I've decided to take those things and kind of turn them on their head. So I'm using those original paintings of Madonna and Child and actually turning them into something else completely. I'm turning them Black. And in the background, I have this scene that really talks about white supremacy and fighting against white supremacy. One of the things I realized is in racism oftentimes is based in fear. And fear in this case is fear of retribution for some of the atrocities that have been committed against peoples of color in the world. So what I'm doing is I'm showing them what that fear is, what they're afraid of, but I'm also kind of counterbalancing that with this image of unconditional love in the mother and child. While I do this work, I'm also kind of schizophrenic, because from time to time, I like to get into the abstraction. And that's what's happening in the second piece that's in the exhibition now. It's called Zong. A lot of people don't know the history of Zong, but it really refers to a slave ship in the late 18th century that traveled from Central Africa to Jamaica. And the captain did not put enough provisions aboard to actually sustain the cargo. And by the time he got close to Jamaica, he had to basically jettison 130 people overboard, basically killed them all. When he gets to Jamaica, he tries to post an insurance claim. It was denied. And then when he gets back to England, he tries again to post this insurance claim, and it was denied again, but it got so much attention and so much publicity that it actually gave rise to the abolitionist movement in England. So in a lot of my work, I'm really very, very concerned with the idea of history and education and getting people to understand that if we don't pay attention to that history, in many ways, it can repeat itself in ways that we have no control over. A lot of the work too is based very heavily in my meditative practice. So when you look at Zong and you see these glyphs that actually look kind of like automatic writing, it is in many ways kind of a throwback to my meditative practice. So each one of those glyphs represents that mantra that you repeat in the course of meditation. With these souls that you see here, as it's the upper right-hand side of it, you'll see they're pretty much as a body would appear, but as they move away from that, going towards the left side, they become distorted because they're actually transforming into the spirit, going into the spirit world. So this work for me is extremely important. That the whole idea of betwixt and between was something that really appealed to me because my practice sometimes, again, goes back and forth between these two worlds.
John, I believe you're muted.
Everybody in 2021 has to say that at least once. And I teach. So Pam, if you wouldn't mind, thank you, Mark. If you wouldn't mind.
Sure. Hi. Yeah. Thanks. Thanks, David, and for inviting me to be a part of this exhibition. And it's been so nice to see the work of all the other artists too, and learn about their take on betwixt and between. So I've been working on what I call a dislocation project now that it started in 2012. And the project really tells, for me, the story of a stone's journey from its place of origin through the studio and eventually to a foreign spot. And I document the stone's travel in such a way that for me, it becomes like a protagonist in a story that addresses ideas of transit, objecthood, and sense of place. So the first thing I do is I find a stone that is everyday, but also looks a bit strange, a stone that's hard to classify, and one that maybe has inconclusive scientific classification and specificity. And then I engage in what I call a visual conversation. I paint the stone's portrait, which you see in this slide is a small 4x4-inch oil painting. And in that period of painting it, I kind of engage in this conversation with the stone, and it informs my final decisions on where to relocate the stone. And for me, this kind of results in a feeling of almost mutual dislocation. In this slide, this is a stone that was actually given to me by a friend. And you can see below the stone is a drawing that I do that is a little bit scientific. There is a map of the place where I finally put the stone, a drawing of its relocated place, and then a description of that process. And so in this case, the stone came to me from a friend who found it in Santa Barbara, California. And it has sort of an interesting story because I asked the friend to bring me a stone and she said, well, how big, what kind? I said, anything that suits you and maybe one that fits in the palm of your hand. And so after she gave me the stone, she said, when she held it in her hand, she was reminded of the stone in the hand of Michelangelo's David, that sculpture, which made me think about the origins of classical sculpture. And I happened to be going to Athens that summer. So I brought the stone with me and placed it on a plinth that was out of bounds, but I was able to reach over and put it on a plinth at the Acropolis. And the writing that I have in the picture about the stone, the top I write about the stone's origin, its place of relocation. There's a little bit of scientific information about its taxonomy. And here I'm playing a little bit with the way science describes objects as opposed to artists or poets. And then when I talk about the characteristics of the stone in this piece, I'll read it to you. I wrote, similar in scale to that held by Michelangelo's David, this stone has a muscular structure. Pictured in three-quarter view, the bravado stance suggests potential use as a weapon. So since 2012, using the same format, I've done about 85 of these stone dislocations. And, you know, I asked myself, why have I done this carefully structured and admittedly purposeless activity over and over again? And I think the answer for me in part lies in the cultural history of stones. And I ask, you know, why do stones capture our minds to such a degree that we've imbued them with healing powers and used them as vessels for contemplation, collected them as storytellers and holders of memory and place? And I'm sure most of us have special stones ourselves that we have on windowsills or counters, or even sometimes a bedside table. And some of the questions that I like to ask are about the relationship between the stone and myself and place and alienation, and, you know, being betwixt and between. Where do we really, what do we really call home, and where do we really live, and what does this, what's dislocation like? And I asked myself if removing stones from their original location, making a study of them, then putting them somewhere where they don't belong, does that change the stone itself in some way? And does the stone become a proxy for feelings of alienation, of being ungrounded or displaced? But then my sense of wonder comes in during the process. And I think, well, what's it like for somebody who finds a stone that doesn't belong? And what does that feel like? And can the sense of dislocation change from one of pain to one of wonder? And when can dislocation feel like home, feel safe? So those are some of the things that I think about and wonder while I'm engaged in this sort of performative art making, traveling process.
Thank you, Pam. Renee, could you reflect on some things that you want to reflect on with your cat, or without, whatever you prefer?
Sorry, of course the cat had to walk by at that time. Yes, thank you for inviting me in the show. I also, it's been nice to hear other artists too talk about their pieces. So I of course thought your idea for this exhibition was so great, and because I live between Los Angeles and Portugal for the past 7 years. So when you told me the idea about it, I was like, oh, I'm living this daily, weekly, and moving work back and forth and making pieces there and bringing them here. And so I was really interested in it. And so for the piece, I made it a site-specific installation, and it's based on the street that my two homes, and the street that I live on in Portugal, which is the part of the title of the piece, Calçada Marquesa de Abrantes 98. And so all the material, all the photographic pieces, which are maybe the viewers can't tell, but looking at it, the pink areas, purple areas on the top is paper, and then everything else other than there's decomposed granite and cement on the ground is photographs. So I wanted to take all the things in it that aren't in Los Angeles, that aren't at my home here, that are sort of like when I'm in LA, are in my head and in my memory and kind of like swirling around in my brain, and have it be through a photograph. And then the decomposed granite and the cement, the concrete, is from my house here in Los Angeles. And so this is basically my work in general is very much influenced by architecture. So it's sort of what goes on in my brain. This is what is happening in my brain when I walk down a street and I'm looking at buildings or sidewalks, or even, you know, subtle things about architecture. And I really wanted them to blend in the space in a way, but also be very different in the sense of the photographs versus the actual the real object, you know, the real material, to compare the where things are sort of in my memory and where they're real for me. So yeah, I think that's about it. I took all the photography work I did in Portugal and I brought it back with me in my, I didn't bring it in my suitcase because I was afraid the suitcase would get lost. I brought it on the plane with me. And then, which sounds harder than it was. Most of it was rolled up, but it still was a lot of stuff. And then, yeah, and then I finished the piece when I was here, which is a pretty normal thing for the past 7 years. A lot of most of the exhibitions I've been in the last 7 years, a portion of them have been made in Portugal and then brought back to LA or shipped somewhere else. Or so I'm moving work a lot, which has also changed the way I will even make work. I'm using more photography because of that as well, because I can transport it everywhere. So in the past, I might have like made a bunch of tile and now I take photos of it instead.
Thank you, Renee. Ismail, would you and Eugene, who have collaborated on a work, maybe come in chorally, however you want to do it, figure out how to talk about this opus that's been put together by at least 4 hands and 2 minds?
Sure thing, yeah. Eugene is allowing me to kind of begin, so I'll kind of do a quick introduction on how he and I met. So yeah, so my name is Ismail de Anda III, and I'd like to introduce Eugene An. You can see him with his cosmic galactic background. Eugene An, digital architect and world builder extraordinaire, right? And so we first met together. I was invited to give a talk at LACC and also to kind of somehow put together a virtual exhibition, right? So, you know, we were kind of working on that. And so then when John kind of mentioned this project, I just thought, you know, I would love to invite Eugene and kind of share these collaborations that we were starting, right? So in terms of betwixt and or between, I think some of the conversations we were having kind of came in from 2 areas. So number one, so this was kind of like at the beginning of this year. So in terms of betwixt and or between, we were still having conversations, how do artists present artworks? The show was, you know, taking place on a college campus, you know, what's going to reopen, what's not going to reopen, how are people experiencing the world? And then the other thing also too, I was sharing with him some of my artworks, and I'll bring up an image here. So I showed him some of the works that I was doing, and I showed him these digital prints that I had been working on. So these are the 2 prints that are in the show, and the title is The Sun Came Out at Night and Sang to Me, and it's a line from Close Encounters of the Third Kind. And so I grew up on the US-Mexico Gateway, and so that kind of influenced my experiences in terms of this idea of betwixt and or between. It was always confusing for me as a kid. We'd be in a car and we were in the state of Texas. We'd take a left turn, all of a sudden we were in New Mexico. We'd be driving, we'd take another left turn, we're in Mexico. Then we're back in Texas again. And then my grandparents had a farm on the banks of the Rio Grande River. So his neighbors were, you know, just on the other side of this, you know, this narrow strip of water. And so it was always kind of confusing to me how people so close, you know, what were the powers that be that were like, how are things territorialized in terms of, you know, identity, placement, those kinds of things. And so I was kind of doing these digital prints as kind of a conceptual way of playing around with the idea of being present or close to something and at a distance at the same time. So I grew up in El Paso, Texas, you know, a few yards away from Ciudad Juarez, Mexico. And so, you know, seeing similar cultures, people, languages, but having different nationalities, but then also me being so close to my heritage, but then also kind of being separated from it. So I started kind of doing these kind of fantastic science fiction type of these flying sculptures. And so for me, like these flying sculptures is this idea, it's like an affirmative gesture, the things that don't have to be beholden to the laws of gravity and they can float and do whatever they want. In my mind, this idea that in art, you know, the imagination is limitless, so you can create anything. So I was sharing these with Eugene, and he said, well, what if we take something like this and what if we animate it? And what if we animate it and people can also kind of interact with it as well? And, you know, a lot of people can have this experience. So our project here is, I'm going to bring up the awesome website for the show. And so, yeah, so the piece that we have here that we created together, it's these digital prints on aluminum. And then this is a video that Eugene created where there's these kind of spinning, they almost kind of look like satellites. And essentially, I designed this so every time I'd cross into Ciudad Juarez, Mexico, and come back, there's a metallic turnstile with these kind of really obnoxious prongs on them, and people would kind of like cram you through there. So I decided to kind of liberate these turnstiles and to kind of just, you know, levitate them out into the air. And there's another app that we're working on that people can actually kind of spin these things, right? So yeah, so I created all these kind of backdrops of places that I've lived. And so there's these, we call them revolutions generators, and they spin, right? And so that's the artwork. So you can watch the video, and then also at the same time, it's just like this kind of triptych with these digital prints and this kind of video and this idea of like kind of digital technology, this idea of something that's tangible but intangible. And then on top of that, Eugene came up with this amazing virtual reality app. So there's a QR code, and you can click on that. And these revolution generators, they appear in the space, or they appear to appear in the space around you. Do you want to share some of those images, Eugene? And then if you want to add your,
no, go ahead, keep narrating. I'll just share screen and pull up some video.
Oh, let me get out of, okay, there we go. So yeah, so this is what you can see happening once you click on the QR codes. So these these revolutions generators, they come out of the video, and they can inhabit anywhere that you would like to place them, right? I think there's another one there.
So these were from phones that were being, the point of this component of the piece is that the people who are seeing the work become participants in the work's expression, and the motifs in the work on the walls come off the walls and then become instruments of the observer. So
yeah, I guess yeah, go ahead.
I just thought it was a great way to as Ismail said, liberate these forms from from their original intent as turnstiles and things to control and contain people. And this app actually, it exists beyond the exhibition space. I think afterwards, I was out at the edge and just kept on using the app. So
yeah, well, I guess I mean, two things. I mean, Eugene was really generous, and he kind of made this comment on my work that I love, that I'm going to continue to think about, that he feels my work is about animating liminal spaces, right? And I love that. And so I think that's what Eugene is doing. And also this idea of betwixt and or between. It's like, how are we experiencing the world these days, And so, I don't know. I just kind of love like those ideas that Eugene was thinking about, and kind of bringing like his technological knowledge. And just one more thing. So I'm just going to show you. So this is the part of the video where you can actually see the turnstile, right? And then Eugene also, he is a drone operator. And so, we also wanted to have like this kind of a site-specific element to the project. And so with his drone camera, the final shot is, so this is like a river in Japan where I got to travel to. And then the final shot that, so this is, the drone hovering over Angel's Gate, so Eugene also kind of incorporated that into the video. So yeah, so thank you everyone. So thanks Eugene. And so yeah, that's the work that we were able to include and share with everyone.
Thank you to all of you. So because Shirley and Fatima and Nena cannot be here, I'd like to just talk for a second. I can't talk in their place because the selection of the work was done by them, but we can talk for a second about their work. So Colleen, if you wouldn't mind bringing up Shirley Tsay's work. As an artist organizer, I have the pleasure of being part of this world as an artist, and also a part as someone who can collate, I call it, I organize. It's like a labor organizer. You put things together and then you let the artists do what they are most interested in. That seems to me to be the best way to be in organizing art shows. So Shirley, who is an artist, is originally Chinese and now American, so she's Chinese and American. And this is actually from an event that happened in her life. And it is a crow that hit her as she was driving on a motorcycle out in the desert. And she told me about it before she made this work. And she was very interested in the idea of like, where will she end up? Coming from China, coming from Hong Kong, and then where? And then she's like, now she lives in Lompoc. So she said, I'm out there with my husband and we're driving along this motorcycle. Out of the blue, this crow suddenly comes flying. And then there's this moment in which I actually think might be the last moment. And so she makes a sculpture about that experience, which, you know, aside from that experience being the generating start of it, it's also got this material relationships that she's been exploring, things that have to do with the way in which hardware, particularly plastics, are something that Shirley's very interested in. The way that plasticity is a word that means so many different things. And so this idea of the different worlds through which one works. And in this case, this actually extraordinarily strange event, which, you know, to think about the number of times you could be hit by an asteroid or by a crow that's flying, it's quite limited. You don't really expect it to happen very often. But as Shirley said, these things seem to happen to me, these kinds of connections. So she also uses double erasure, which is correction tape, using words that are both in Chinese, but also in English. They have a lot more of a political betwixt and between, because when you say power down release in the context of what's going on in China with Taiwan, then it becomes a very different matter. So her idea is that you look at the way in which powered, own real, and ease, power down release. And then in Chinese, how it breaks down, it starts to also talk about the betwixt and between of someone who's both from one place, but from another place, and how those two realities mesh, as it were, or not, or maybe don't mesh, maybe they just kind of crunch. So then there's the one other work. This is the most recent one that Shirley did. And Shirley said, how did I end up in Lompoc? She had this very wonderfully plaintive question, which I thought was both wonderful and also, you know, she said, here I am in this place that's got this prison. It's also got these amazing technological things happening. So she made this space suit, which is done with this optic fibers and a snake skin. She said, so I'm kind of like shedding one way of being to become another way, but I'm still this luminous essence that's floating between them. And this really literally got completed because of the exhibition, because she said, you know, I didn't have any reason to complete it, but when you asked me to be a part of Betwixt and Between, I realized now is a good time. And I found that happens with artists sometimes. There's a catalyzing moment. And so this is another of the works in which there's these, you know, very, I would say, almost diametrically opposed kinds of elements physically. And then also, I want to say that of all the artists in the show, all of them are incredibly interested in also formal betwixt and betweens, use of graphics, use of paints, use of fiber, use of projections. I mean, it's really, as someone who's organizing shows, I'm always amazed by the bandwidth that's being explored by artists who use everything from decomposed concrete to traveling drawings. So that, you know, that's one of the sort of extreme pleasures. If we could, let's go on and maybe see, Colleen, the work of Fatima Burns. Fatima is doing well. Unfortunately, she got into a car incident, which wasn't very good, so she could not make it. She's dealing with all those things. This is a series from Crossovers. They're all paintings, and they all deal with the different borders that Fatima is familiar with. Fatima originally started in Iran, and from Iran, she went to Paris. And from Paris, she went elsewhere and elsewhere and elsewhere, and ended up in Los Angeles, where she lives. And she has a son who lives in Holland, 2 daughters that live in the United States. And her idea of the Crossover series is to talk about the numerous portals through which immigrants have to go. She feels that the world doesn't really understand the reasons for which people cross over, to go through these portals. The works themselves are often quite abstract. She doesn't want them to have incredibly specific types of references, but she's thinking, while she's making those specific crossovers, places that the borders are more dangerous, places that the borders are a lot easier, places where the crossover, the changeover, the becoming other than one was once is a very important part of evolution as an artist. And there's sometimes elements that are more recognizably architectural, other times there's things that are entirely just about the texture. And the crossover series that was put together for Betwixt and Between was, as they always are, a brand new enumeration. This is Plum Isle, but you know, the truth of the matter is that the way that she puts these grids together varies from place to place. It's not that it's got one solid and completely regularized way of appearing. She likes to use the grid because she wants them to have equal weight, but she doesn't want them to be fixed in a relationship because, as a matter of fact, she views the crossovers as being things that are moving through states. And there's a kind of allusion to that too in the liquidity and the fluidity of much of the work. It's not about solidifying. There's chunks and there's bits that are more crystallized, but then others that are much, much more fluid. And so that was the work that Fatima put together for the Betwixt and Between. And she talks a lot about going back and forth between different places and speaking different languages and adapting to different norms. And she said, you know, here I am imprisoned in this one husk, and yet the husk moves around and it has to assume many different identities everywhere it goes. And then let's go ahead and maybe take the work of Nena Amsler, another artist who is not necessarily Betwixt and Between. Let me just say she's both and or, no, both and. So Nena actually is Peruvian Swiss. So that's already a really interesting mixture, if you can think of that. Stereotypically in the world, as she said, it's not a good mix. But she said, actually, in my family, it works out fine. She said, but you know, the Swiss would normally like Peruvian, the Peruvian's like Swiss. But so she's done these works. Her technique is to utilize things that are very opposing one another. So this is a series from the series that she calls Bubbles. Right now, she's called it Untitled. She frequently renames her work in progress, which I think is also something that people who are betwixt and between, they like to call our attention. So this is a series called Bubbles. It's using air and resin and drawing, and it's typically untitled. And it's got to do a lot with how your perception, how our perception, how my perception doesn't let me just look at one surface. I have to look through it to see the other, to see the reflections. And this work, the Bubbles work, which you can see almost looks like a kind of manuscript, and you can see the resin, the way that it sets up and the way that it gets disturbed by the air. It's opposed by works, or not opposed, but it's placed side by side by work in which the other kind of molecular activity that's coming around in the world is placed, which is the ones that are based on the work that she calls dirt. And in the dirt, there are elements that look like there might have been found in the desert floor. There's elements that might have been dropped off of somebody's hand. And she also is very interested in exploring the antithesis of materials from one to another. And these are extraordinarily fragile and beautiful. And they're also very kind of a magical landscape. She wants them to be viewed as though you could look for them from above, but also you could look at them frontally as well. So the two, you can see there's little elements that are kind of crawling around, these creatures that are making the Song of the Shaman. And once again, it's been retitled a number of times. I used to have an issue with, and I'd say, Richard, please keep the title the same, at least when you send them to me, so I know which one you're talking about. So this went from being dirt now to being untitled, which is fine. And it's altered acrylic, paint on panel. So those were the artists. Those are the artists that I invited to be a part of Betwixt and Between. I'm very honored that they would trust me enough to believe that my very flexible understanding of their poetics would allow them to put things in that would make sense. And listening to the talk, I personally find it extraordinarily interesting how the different perspectives, there's things that superimpose, there's things that converge, there's things that diverge. But I think that that's one of the things that I find so amazing about the art world, and places like Angels Gate allow us to come together in a kind of hub and to not necessarily become homogeneous, not to be merged into one, but to allow these different points of view to coexist together. And that's one of the wonderful things about being able to be an artist organizer. So I'm grateful for all of the voices. And I'm sorry that Nena and Fatima and Shirley weren't able to make it, but I'm glad that I was able to give at least part of what I know. They would have been much more insightful because they are they and I am other, but I still think that I was able to give I wanted to mention the work. And the show is really beautiful. So if you have a chance, I mean, beautiful in the sense, it's a visually stunning thing to do, to be able to go in and see. And so I would encourage you, if you can, if you haven't made it down there yet, to go ahead and go down there. So I guess as an artist, I should talk about my own work as well. Cecilia, is that what your plan is? Okay.
Yes, I was going to butt in if you didn't get there.
All right, then we can circle back and ask the artist. One of the things that's really fascinating for me, and I don't mean to go last on purpose, but because I am the organizer and an artist, I always find that when others talk about their work, it then informs how I think about my work. So listening to, Pam and Alexis and Mark, Eugene, Ismail, and Renee, it's like now suddenly my view is totally changed from what it was when I was first thinking about it. So good, let's go ahead and put up some images. I think I mentioned before that I'm an Italian and I'm an American. I also am a person who is very interested in memory. So this is part of a series that talks about my being born in Japan, and my father's photography is what I was using for this work. And I call it Accidental Orientalist. And it's meant to be in a very ironic key. I understand Orientalism is an incorrect view of Asia, but at the same time, it was also the kind of view that artists from elsewhere had. When I was in Italy, I was a 17-year-old, I was an Italian-American citizen, and I got a letter from the Japanese consulate telling me that I had Japanese citizenship if I give up all my other citizenships and go to Japan. And as a 17-year-old, I was like, yeah, that rocks. My father was like, yes, that's not going to work. It's really not going to work. Luckily, I was too stupid at 17 to actually do anything. So I managed to make it to 18 without activating that. But this is a sculpture that's based on slides that he took as a military person in Japan before my birth. And the other images from this series, which I hope will come up next, are also about taking his slides and from those slides, building an imaginary projected relationship to, in this case, Japan. I think it's beautiful. And I was there for 3 or 4 years. So there's some part of it, but these floating discs are almost like the kinds of floaters that people have in their eyes, or the kinds of things they see after they got hit in the head with a golf ball. It's the idea, there's this sense of like, okay, I sort of see it, but I sort of don't. So I went back into his, I think, rather bad photography and made it a little bit more acceptable through abstraction. Can you take the next slide from that? Actually, is there one from the Occidental Orient series first? Can you go to that? The last one, or maybe they're doing it different order. Okay, this is fine, Colin. Nope, go back. Go back. Is there one more from, I think there's one more. Oh, maybe there's not. Okay, so go back to the one you just were at, please, which is something that instead is based. So when I was in Rome, I was a young man, and you could go into the Imperial Forum. So the very first project I did in academia, which was graduate school, was a photo project of myself. And you can see 2 people sitting in this. We actually were able to sit in the Imperial Forum to walk where, Marcus Aurelius was killed. It was like really Caesar it was amazing. You can't do that anymore. So then pretty much 30 years later, I'm doing a project in Italy, and my son found these old images. So I used them to create a sort of return to that past. This is an image from the original photo that I took, and then I've obviously painted on top of it. And it's about what the distance in time does with our imagination. And also imagination comes into play a lot in memory. Can you go to the next image? That's also another one. If you see in the middle of those 4 figures, the one to the right is Gigi. The one that's outlined against the wall is me, standing there with my coveralls on. And then my friend Antonio and my friend Fiorella, we were sitting in the Imperial Forum, which if you try to do that today, you'll get arrested. It's very, very illegal. It's not allowed. So those are my sort of revisitations of those moments at a distance of many years, in which I go back and view what I left as a residue, this idea of, at that time, I wanted all the figures to kind of disappear and become one with the landscape, to be one with the history. Now I realize it's really important to separate out and to not just disappear into the landscape, but also emerge and speak about the histories that those landscapes represent. So the final image is one that's a two-sided image. You can see the left-hand side and the right-hand side together. It comes out from the wall perpendicularly, and it's called Holes in the Sky. And it talks about living in small towns. So the one side's got a little bit more fiery intrusion, and it's black and white. And then the other side's got a little bit more of a darker, almost reed-like or weed-like or coral-like extrusion. And those intrusion, because they're actually cut into wood. And that's got the more colorful landscape. And that's my way of talking about both the pleasure and pain of living in small environments. I lived in small Italian cities for much of my life. And on the one hand, it's really great to be in the palm of this world. On the other hand, you're like, if people don't stop following me around to watch what I'm doing every 5 minutes, I'm going to kill them. I really just feel like your head's going to blow up. You're like, people stop you in the street you don't know and ask about things they shouldn't know about. And you're like, and in your small city, you just can't yell at them. You just say, oh, okay, well, I'm busy right now. I'm going to go to the market, but I'll be back later. I'll let you know what I'm doing tomorrow night when I have time. So anyway, this is one of those works that talks about, I've lived in extremely large places like Rome and Naples, Los Angeles and New York, and other really small places like Porca del Monte, Urbino. So these are the kinds of straddling, and you learn. Every time I go back to Italy, I have to start talking slow again. I get to Umbria and I go into a store and I'm like, buongiorno, blah, blah, blah. And they're like, they wait till I'm done. They say, buongiorno, what would you like? And they make me start all over again because I'm going at warp speed for California, going at warp speed for Los Angeles. So, and I actually think they're right and I'm wrong. I just forgot to change. And so now I try to, on the plane over, just sit and say, okay, I'm changing. I'm doing this one, I'm doing that one. So that's a little bit of my betwixt and between. But mostly what I really like is being betwixt and between as an organizer, because I get to be an artist and I get to propose my own poetics. I get to be very self-centered in myself. But then as an organizer, I get to extend the occasions that the world, through Angels Gate, Cecilia and Colleen, and other places, offer me to allow for the platform to extend. And I feel like that is my way of working as a part of a community that I'm very honored and proud and grateful to be a part of. So that's how I feel about these occasions. And I don't know where we could go from here. Cecilia, do you have an idea?
Well, thank you for that. Selfishly, I love these artist talks because I am not the organizer or the curator of this show. So I feel I receive so much more valuable insight into the works and why you selected these artists. So thank you all for speaking a little bit about your pieces. I would say that for any of the attendees, if you did have any questions, either in a general question or for any particular artist, feel free to put it in the Q&A feature or even the chat. And I would say at this time, the artists, if they have questions for each other, or I have a few questions that are kind of, I was thinking of as it sort of came up in your conversations. And John, as you mentioned earlier, there were several overlapping themes that different artists share that I saw within the works. And something that I thought was quite interesting, and Pam kind of alluded to it earlier. She posed the question: when does dislocation become transformative? When does it transform? So it's not only exploring this one location and another location, it's also what is the transformation that's happening when these two places are kind of meeting and becoming something new. And I'm curious if any of the artists want to speak to that, how transformation kind of is present in your work and what that purpose is to you, and then perhaps what it means. And there's a few artists who I feel like it's really pertinent to. So I could pick on artists individually, or if anyone wants to volunteer and sort of talk about that, I'd love to hear more about that.
Your mics are off, you can't be heard. So you just remember that. You got to turn them on.
I think I can't see everyone, if anyone wanted to jump in, but I think
I wanted to say, maybe adding to what you said, one of the interesting things about being betwixt and between that I've experienced personally, and that I heard echoes of in a lot of people, in Mark's, in Ishmael's, in Renee's, in Alexis, there was a moment in time in which one felt, I think people felt, that there was like a decision that had to be made, either here or there. I feel like the moment that we're in, that's not the decision that we need to make. We need to be generous, critical. So those are two things that don't always work together. And at the same time, find ways to build these tenuous bridges so that there isn't exclusion as the rule. It's actually more about how we can find communicative, sort of connective tissues between things that weren't apparently supposed to be coextensive. You know, Mark was talking about the abstraction versus the figuration, and just to choose one. And Alexis was talking about the way in which the decorative also then fuses with sort of the verbal. And so there's this, at least the written. And so I think that I view that as being something that emerged from this conversation in a way that was very clear, and that it's not about a world of oppositional energies. They're also included, but that's not the focus. It's now how those oppositions somehow find a way to continue, even with the ways in which they are not meshing, to work through whatever the difficulties and conflicts are, whatever the antimonies, whatever the contrasts are. So I don't know, maybe if somebody wants to add in, you're welcome to.
Well, I have a question for you, Cecilia, and you, Colleen. So I'm thinking maybe the both of you have spent the most time in the gallery with the works. I mean, is there any unexpected connections that we're starting to build for you amongst the artists as you spent time in this space? I mean, I'm curious if you had any of those experiences.
Yes, I will try not to hog the rest of this time because I love nerding out about the art where I work. I think it's great. I will say absolutely. I think John mentioned it earlier, which was really striking to me, was the transformation of materials. And what really got me thinking about that was the works by Nena, where she used the air bubbles as a form of drawing, and she transformed the paint to look like the earth. And that also, connects back transformation again to your work. And Eugene, you made an interesting statement. You said it's sort of like you're liberating these forms that are used in an oppressive manner, and you're releasing them and you're breaking them free and you're transforming their original intention. So absolutely, there's all sorts of these threads that sort of come across in the work. And if I could pivot a little bit, what I also wanted to comment on and question about was, Mark, your works, in particular your work Zong, is pretty large, and it really engages the body. And I know that series of works, of those drawings, you have much larger, correct? How large does that series span? I'm just curious how large those get.
I've got about 8 pieces about that size. However, it's really interesting. Cal State Dominguez Hills has taken 7 of those pieces and they've done renditions of them at 600%. So I'm seeing them from floor to ceiling now, and it's really kind of inspiring me to maybe do them even larger. My biggest problem, of course, is storage. It's like you do those things and then where do you put them? But I invite everybody to go to Cal State Dominguez. It's the Innovation and Instruction building there. And they have my work on all 4 floors of that building right now. And they're all in the vein of Zong. And Zong is actually one of them too.
Well, I just think it's wonderful, especially because it's just so large, and I encourage everyone to see the show before it comes down here in a few weeks. But it got me thinking that you really have to interact with that piece on a bodily scale, and it really encompasses your body and your presence. And I think it kind of just, again, reflects to the significance of the subject matter and the sheer scale, right, of lives and history that you're referencing in this series of works. And I just think that that is quite an impactful piece to experience in person. And I know seeing it small doesn't really do it justice. So I really encourage everyone to come and visit the gallery and see all the works in person. And then another work too, where I feel like it's I mean, all of these you need to see in person, but I'd kind of like to pivot to Renee and talk a little bit more about this idea of transformation, and you're living and existing in these two locations, and how you feel these custom installations. Is it exploring something new, or is it more just combining these two locations and experiences for you? I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, it's interesting because when you were just talking, I was remembering back to an email that you and I were chatting in about how when you're in Italy, where you're thinking about like being in the US, and when you're in the US, you're thinking about parts of Italy, or how we make work and all that. And I think that it's so true. It's like, I don't even think of them as, of course they're physically very separate, but in my head, or in the way that I'm making work, they're so intertwined that it's sort of, I guess I didn't even, of course, when you think about the logisticals of moving work and all of that, but like once John brought up the idea of the exhibition, I started to even look into it more, like how one place was really affecting my work in another way, or vice versa. And so so yeah, for this piece, I mean, what was your question? You asked what did you ask again? Sorry.
So I'm curious, this idea of transformation, if that's something that's present in your work, or if it's more like a culmination of pulling two different experiences together.
In general, in my other work, you mean, as well? Transformation, I think, is definitely, I mean, the pieces, they're always in motion. They always seem to be like something has happened, which I want them to feel that way. I want them to feel like they're sort of in this state of flux of like, you can't really tell like maybe what's happening, and if something's just happened to it, then it's falling apart, or if something is like growing out of that. Or so I do want them to, you know, be in this state of transforming into different things. And as well as it's why I take an image, not in this piece specifically, but I'll take the actual object or a paver or something, and then take a photograph of that as kind of using the material to show a transformation in that way. But yeah, my work in general is very much it all has that kind of energy to it. And I think that you know, the pieces also come back to my studio and they never look the same. And sometimes part of them end up back in my yard, or they end up in a drawing meaning like a piece on a wall, but not necessarily a drawing. I don't really have this this need to kind of keep them like they are, which also is a little stressful too, but I kind of enjoy that side of it, that it's like, okay, yeah, it's done, and I take it apart and we'll see what happens to it. I don't look at them as so precious or anything. So.
Thank you. Well, if anyone else wants to jump in, any other artists, please, this is not a monopoly, but I did have one more question I'm going to sneak in, and that is for Alexis, and also for everyone in general. Obviously, the thing that everyone has had to deal with is the pandemic, the state of our lives. And Alexis, several of your pieces are titled, well, untitled quarantine weavings. So I'm just curious, you know, that direction of your work, and afterwards, if anyone else wants to jump in, how that impacted your work, and a little bit more about that in this series.
During the lockdown, I was making a lot of work, and using a lot of different materials. I love material exploration. And like Renee was just saying, I also like to I also do sculpture and installation and take things apart and use them again and again. Also because I also hate wasting things. But so yes, that actually, the weaving during quarantine was, just to keep my hands busy, and I could sit literally on the couch while my children were watching some goofy stuff on TV, and I could be with them, but like just weaving and being productive. And that actually is what led to the mashallah, is the idea that, it's such a human thing to want to wish, protection over the children, family, things that are precious to you, and that it's such a human feeling. And so that's, as the weaving started, I was thinking about that sort of was the natural progression, was to think about mashallah and that wish for, my family and for others, when you were hearing about enormous hardships and loss. And so that's where that all came from, was the pandemic, and then completely rooted in my past and present.
Thank you. Now I kind of want to open it up. Do any of the artists sort of have questions for each other?
I had sort of a general thought about sort of what you were saying about transformation and flux and betwixt and between, and the pandemic. And I'm sitting here looking at these squares of faces of people, and I don't know where you are. And I find that Zoom in general, and our way of communicating without being with someone, is very disorienting and dislocating. I mean, where are you? Right? I'm old enough to remember having a landline phone, one in the house, and I would call a family member and I knew right where they were because I knew where the phone was. And now I call my children and I have no idea sometimes what country they're in. Where are we in this place now that is so determined by the internet? And I'm wondering if any of you others share that sense of betwixt and between in a sort of existential way. Revealed a lot there.
When the lockdown first happened, I was actually teaching a class in experimental drawing. And it was kind of crazy because, I'd have to have the students send me JPEGs of their progress about every 15 or 20 minutes. And I would be up to 1 o'clock in the morning sometimes going back and forth with the students. And after that, I just refused to teach. I said, I can't do this. It's too much. So it's interesting. We're going to go back in the spring and I'm going to teach one class. And then I think I'm going to throw in the towel. I've done it.
Yeah, the pandemic really did precipitate decisions of this sort, don't you think, Mark?
I think so, yeah. I know a lot of people that are retiring. I've had it.
Or they're just deciding that pause in time, that dislocation in space was enough to say, I want to rethink things in ways that in 2019 we would have never rethought, because we were on a treadmill. Yeah. And the treadmill made sense the way it was going. And so we kept on it. And then suddenly the treadmill jerked to a stop. You couldn't keep going. And you're like, did I want to keep going after all? Is that really what I wanted to do? Right?
Absolutely.
Cecilia, you're using the word kind of transformation. I was also thinking about like translations also too. And so I don't know. So I think it's kind of cool or interesting now that we're having the opportunity, like this exhibition, to experience art physically again. And like you were talking about how this show was first kind of developed kind of before the pandemic. So it's interesting. I think we're in a place now where hopefully, that we're able to kind of have this physical experience again. And it was great at the opening to get to see the other artists, but also kind of with this already kind of this translation or this experience of these elements of the pandemic and different ways that we're kind of experiencing the world. And it's been interesting too, because I don't know, I kind of feel like the pandemic, my work has kind of developed in a little bit because I've had the opportunity to have like shows with Durden and Ray where they were doing drive-by shows. And so I don't know, I like artists that I've talked to, you know, more of those creative approaches by artists were also starting to happen where, you know, there are online exhibitions, virtual exhibitions, drive-by exhibitions. How do we keep being pro-creative to a certain extent as being artists? And so I think all those things have happened and maybe have added additional translations to a lot of the artists' work. And then now we're kind of back in, you know, the physical experience. And I don't know, I think so. I guess those layerings are kind of interesting for me. And I don't know, that was really exciting for me, yeah, to be kind of be in person and see everyone's work in person physically again. And I don't know, so at this point I kind of feel like those layerings are things that I'm still kind of I don't know, I guess yeah, contemplating, I guess. So
yeah, there's like just districating the different levels, right? Trying to figure out how to get them to work. And I'm sorry if I heard somebody, but I think that it was interesting to conceive of a show prior to a pandemic, then have the show put off because of the pandemic, and then put the show together after the pandemic. And I do think that there was this supposition before, which was not always a good supposition. It's not mine because of the way that I'm between cultures, but sometimes what you might call norms get carried through when they're not norms at all. They're just like habitual forms of thinking. And so I think now, to Pam's point, I think oftentimes artists now are actually going to mark off historically, thematically, racially, socially, where they are, so that you don't have to ask where they're coming from. And it's not a given that they're all from the same place. So I think that that's actually been a positive change in the art world in general. It's never been my, you know, I always tell people, you know, when I was living in Italy, like the whole pantheon of canonical figures and everybody was cool was totally different. And as a military child, every time I went to a new school, the new cool people were always different. I was like, there's something weird about this whole cool thing. And I don't think that's not very trustworthy because it keeps changing from school to school and certainly changed from country to country. So I didn't feel like I was a part of it. But then every time I got to an art world, they always seemed to be like, these are the rules, these are the roads, these are the ways. It's like, yeah, but you're missing a lot of stuff. So to me, the opening up of the necessity to be more explicit about your location, and I intend it in many different ways, not geophysically only, is a really good thing. I think it's a really good thing. And I think it also means that people are also beginning to look more, not just through the lens of what they already know, but through the lens of what they haven't yet learned, which we need from each other, this opening onto understanding that's not just a given because you come from a certain socio-economical, political, racial, historical framework. It's like, that's, sorry, it might have been a good place to start, but then you grow up and you have to expand it to find these other types of, and you have to be betwixt and between much more so than before. So I think the stereotype before, you could say, oh, I'm just a standard fill in the blank. It's like, no, you're not. Now you have to kind of work your way back to what's your standard and how's it compare? Which I think artists have always done a lot of, but I think now even more than before, it's a really important part of what we're in the world.
John, check out a book called The History of Hip by a guy named John Leland.
Okay, I will. Okay. Yeah.
He talks a little bit about where you're going with this.
Yeah, no, I remember going to the next school and just thinking, how come these are the cool people here? But the joke experience I tell people is like, when I went from Arizona to New Jersey was the day I walked into school dressed in my blue jeans and my blue shirt, pearl snaps, and my bolo tie and my boots. And everybody there was wearing black jeans, t-shirts, and sneakers. And I was just like, oh, could they please teleport me out of here now before the day starts? But it also helped me in the sense that after that, I became very much about like, I think that the platform is one you bring with you. It's not the one that you know, because if you keep changing, and I love both New Jersey and Arizona. It's not like I don't like either, but I would probably not go back to New Jersey wearing my turquoise blue cowboy shirt with my bolo tie with the pearl snaps. It just, unless I wanted to go to it like a dance, and then maybe it would work, So that was my dislocation, Pam. It was and when you're younger too, you're really subject to the desire to be neutral, to merge, if you can, right? There's those that can't. So anyway, so all wonderful conversations. Thank you very much for being here and being with us. And I don't know if there's any questions because I can't see any, but I think that Cecilia, if we are not, if there's anybody here or elsewhere that wants to continue this, we can. And if not, we can say thank you and have a wonderful evening. And we will see each other again, in person soon.
Yes, and I just want to make sure, I'm going to put it out there one more time. December 11th is the last day of the exhibition. We have open gallery hours. You don't have to make an appointment. We have open gallery hours between 10 and 4 p.m. Thursdays through Saturdays, where we will be closed Thanksgiving and the Friday after, but then we'll reopen. We are enacting some COVID safety protocols. All of those are available on our website. This exhibition is also in a virtual format. So just really quick, I just want to share, I know some of the artists aren't always local to Angels Gate, and also if any of our attendees right now are not local, we do have a virtual exhibition that we started before our, and Ishmael shared this earlier, but before we reopened the space to the public, this was our adaptation to our current situation. So this is available again on our website, right there, angelsgateart.org. So please take a look at that. And I want to say that there weren't any questions in the chat feature. There was mostly accolades and praise for all of you. So thank you so much for your time tonight. There is another exhibition concurrently downstairs. Hair Pulling Between Good and Evil is also on view. And please visit our website. We have a plethora of programs, including we have a family art workshop on Zoom this Saturday that is open to the public as well. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us tonight. Were there any last comments or questions?
Thank you all for being so generous. It's very appreciated.
And Pam, I saw that if you want to unmute yourself. Oh, just a wave goodbye. Okay, well, thank you, everyone. And if the artists want to hang on for a few minutes, but thank you, everyone, for joining us, and have a good night. Thank you so much.